Hey there, welcome back to Blender Gunpla, the series where we're exploring how to use Blender to create custom detail parts for your Gunpla kits. And today I want to talk about vents. I think this is a good place for us to get started on our very first project here, because vents are pretty simple, but you can use them in a lot of different ways. And so what I want to talk about today is how I go about thinking about designing a part when I don't really have a good idea of all of the details that I want to put into it yet. And that's by thinking about the very simplest form of whatever that thing is. So if I think about the very simplest vent that I could imagine, I have an example of it here for you. It's just a rectangular frame, and it's got some thickness to it that we could, potentially increase or decrease. And then it's got these fins in the middle, or slats, or whatever we want to call them, that are just all lined up. Now this one isn't that interesting, right? It's got very sharp corners, it's pretty blocky. You're probably also thinking it's really big, and that's true. I've printed all of these examples that I'm about to show you at about 2 to 3 times the size that I designed them at. So this is certainly bigger than what you'd want to use on a Gunpla kit, but it makes it easier for us to look at them here on camera. So what I want to do today is build in Blender this very simple vent. And then let's see if we can make modifications to it and just change some of its parameters and settings to create other variations. And here are some of the other variations that I created when I was working through the idea for this video. So we've got everything here from something that's square with a crosshatch type fin pattern inside of it. We've got this one which has a more interesting outer shape, and it actually has a more interesting shape to the fins as well, but that's not showing up on camera that great. This one again has some fins that stick up out of the vent. This one here is very interesting. It's got a slanted design to it, and the fins inside have quite a lot of detail. We'll create something like this toward the end of this video in Blender so you can see it in more detail. So that's the plan for today. We'll start with something like this that's very simple to make, and then we'll adjust and modify it and see what other variations we can come up with. They might not all be the same as what I've created here, and I'm sure that you'll be able to come up with your own variations by the time we get to the end of this as well. And I'd love for you to share those with me once you do. So I'm gonna fire up Blender and get ready to go. I suggest that you do the same if you'd like to follow along, and then let's go create some vents. All right, so here we are in a brand new empty Blender file, and we're gonna start by making the rectangular outline of our vent. So I'm gonna hit the 7 key on the numpad to go into top-down view here, and we're gonna start by sketching out the outer rectangle shape that we want to put the vent inside of. And so I'm not gonna do a tutorial here on the ND add-on. I actually have a previous video that I made on the channel, and I will put a card up in the corner right now to link you over to that if you want more information on how to use ND. I'm gonna assume that you've either gone through that or gone through some of their tutorials that you can find as well. So we're gonna go a little bit quickly here because we've got a lot to cover. So I'm gonna bring up the ND fast menu. I'm gonna choose single vertex to create myself a vertex here at the origin. I'm gonna hit E to extrude it, move it up this way. I'm gonna actually constrain it to the Y-axis, and then I'm gonna type 10 because we want this to be 10 millimeters tall. Got to zoom out a little bit here so we can see the whole thing. Then we're going to extrude again along the X-axis this time by 5 millimeters. Hit enter. Extrude again along the Y-axis by 10 again, but this time negative. So I hit the minus key, hit enter. And now we could use the ND make manifold to close this up, but that creates a face here, and I don't want a face, I just want the outline of the rectangle. So I'm just gonna shift select this other point here, and then I'm gonna hit F and say make edge. So now we have this empty rectangle, right? So I'm gonna hit the ND fast menu again with this rectangle selected, and we're gonna do profile extrude, which will allow us to bring that vertically. Now by default, profile extrude is going on the X-axis, and that's not what we want. We want to extrude it on the Z-axis. So you hit the A key to toggle through X, Y, and then the Z-axis. So now we're making some vertical height on this outer frame for our vent. And you'll see that it's going above and below the Z-axis. So I'm gonna hit the W key to change the weighting to make it just be above the X-axis. I'll type 1,000 here. Just a quick note, when you're entering numbers manually in the ND tools, if you want like 1 millimeter, you have to type 1,000. If you want 2 millimeters, 2,000. If you want half a millimeter, it's 500. So whatever number you want in millimeters, just multiply that in your head by 1,000. So I'll hit enter to lock that in. And now we have some height to this thing, but there's no thickness to it yet. So I'm gonna open up the ND fast menu again and choose solidify. And that now allows us to add some thickness to this thing. Again, I wanna change the weighting. So I'm gonna hit W because I want this to be expanding inward from that original rectangular outline that we drew. I'm assuming that that outline, those dimensions were something maybe you've measured on your kit that you're trying to fit something within. So we want to make sure that we're staying within those dimensions. And I think I'll type 1,000 here as well, just to make a nice chunky wide frame. And we can always change this later if we want, right? Because what ND is doing is, if we look over here in our modifier stack, it's creating all of these modifiers and just adding them onto that original rectangle that we drew. So it's easy for us to go in and change any of those thicknesses or other things down the road. But for now, I'm happy with this being the outer frame of our vent. So let's go ahead and think about the slats inside. Actually, before we do that, I'm gonna go up here to our object name, and I'm just gonna change this to frame, because that'll make it easier for us to remember which one is which. ND by default names things like ND sketch and a number. So we'll do it this way. All right, so now we have our frame. I'll deselect that. I'm gonna hit the 1 key on the numpad so we're looking at it from the end. And I'm gonna zoom in just a little bit, kind of move this over so we can see it better. And we're gonna do another sketch for the vertical thin piece that we want to have inside of this frame. So again, we're gonna do single vertex. We're going to extrude it, this time upwards in the Z direction. And the height, the exact height doesn't matter here. So I'm gonna hold down Control, which snaps to the grid. And I'm gonna just make it, you know, a couple of grid notches here below the top of the outer frame of the vent. And then we're gonna extrude it again this way in the X direction. And again, I'll just hold down Control and line it up with this edge over here. And then extrude it in the Z direction down here. Hold down Control, hit that corner. And now I am going to use the ND fast menu and say make manifold, which will fill this thing in with a flat face, in addition to closing in the rectangle. Now, if we look at this in 3D mode, you can see here that it's just sitting right on the edge of our vent, which is not exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and move this, constrain it in the Y direction, and I'll move it kind of up here into the middle part of the frame just so that we can see it a little bit better. So we have this very narrow, it's actually infinitely narrow rectangle sitting here. And again, we can use the ND tool solidify to add some thickness to it, right? Maybe, again, because we're making this super chunky, and then we can thin it out later if we want it to look a little bit more like a real vent. We'll do 500 here, which is half of a millimeter. And then you can see we've got this. Now, one quick side note, if I deselect this, you'll notice that Blender has a little bit of a rendering issue right here. And it's because the edge of this thin piece is exactly lined up with the outside edge of our frame as well. So like on both sides here, you'll see it's a little bit strange. Now, if you just export this as an STL and you print it on your 3D printer, there won't be a problem at all. But if that annoys you and you're not happy with seeing that as you move things around in Blender, one thing we could always do is make this thing just a little bit narrower. So again, I'll go in the end view here with 1 on my numpad. I'm gonna hit Alt-Z actually as well so that it makes this semi-transparent so we can kind of see through the outside of it a little bit. And if I tab into edit mode, I can actually just grab these 2 vertices and move them along the X-axis, and we'll just, again, hold down Control to snap to the grid. And I'll just move 1 grid notch in, and then I'll do the same thing here, move these on the X-axis 1 grid notch inward. And so now, if I tab out of here and hit Alt-Z again to make it solid, you'll see that it is rendering better, right? This bar actually ends inside of the frame, so it's not changed anything as far as the structure of our object, but Blender's less confused about those faces being exactly on top of each other because they're not anymore. So This is one of our fins, and actually let's go ahead over here and rename this and just call it fins. It's going to be all of the fins. Right now it's just one of them. So in order to make it all of the fins, we just need to copy it a bunch of times, right? So if we go again into the ND fast menu, we can see array cubed. This actually allows us to copy it in the X, Y, and Z axis directions simultaneously. And actually, to show you that, I'm gonna zoom out a little so we can see more of the space around this vent. So if I do this array cubed and I start to copy this thing, you'll see by default it's in the X direction, so it's making copies either that way or that way. We don't want that, so we'll roll that back down to 1, hit A to change the axis to the Y axis, and now we can make some copies like that, right? We could also make copies in the Z axis. So it allows you to make a lot of copies of things all at once if you need to. But we'll go back to the Y axis here. Maybe we'll do 8, and you can also change the offset by holding down Control, and then we can make the slats, either closer together or further apart. I'm gonna leave it at 2 for now. Hit enter to lock that in. I created this extra copy because there's a space here, so we can move this in the Y direction and kind of come back this way and even it out. In fact, you can hit 7 on your numpad if you want to view it top down, and then you can really dial it into exactly centered if you'd like. So with that, there's our very basic vent. That's about the simplest thing we could have made. It's just the frame on the outside with the fins across the middle repeating. And if that was all a little fast and overwhelming, that's fine. Take a breath for a second. Go ahead and go back and try the steps again yourself. I know I went pretty quickly. I've got a lot to cover here, so I'm trying to go as quickly as possible. And I'm gonna take a little bit of a break here as well. And we'll come back in just a second and we'll see what additional pieces we can add to this vent or changes we can make to the modifiers that we've already put on there to make it look more interesting, maybe change its shape, maybe change the fins a little bit. So we'll see what kinds of changes we can make to it to make different variations up next. Okay, are you ready to modify this basic vent and make it more interesting? I am, because I'm tired of looking at it. It's a bit blocky and boring. So let's do a couple of things to it. First of all, I think the frame is too thick. So one thing you can always do is recall the modifiers that you've already done with ND and change them. So if we select that frame and we go back to the solidify modifier, which was the thing that added the thickness to the frame, we can change it. It remembers what we had it set at, which was 1000, which is 1 millimeter. Let's maybe cut that about in half. Maybe we'll go down to about, 600 or so, and lock that in. So now we've got a narrower frame. Likewise, I would like these fins inside to be a little bit narrower as well. So again, we'll bring back their solidify modifier and we'll drop this down. Now we are planning to be able to 3D print this object. And so if we go too narrow with these, they won't 3D print well. So I'm not gonna go less than maybe about 300 there, which is 0.3 of a millimeter. And now we don't have enough of these to fit in this frame anymore. So we can hit F again. We can go back to our array modifier and roll this up to add a few more of these fins into our array. So we'll do about like that. I'll hit 7 again to go to the top view and move this in the Y direction to center it out. So now we have something like this. That's a little bit nicer. The corners, the very sharp corners, are bugging me a little bit though. So we can always add a bevel modifier. So we'll hit F here, we'll choose the bevel modifier and we'll increase the width of it a bit. And you see it's rounding out that edge. Now by default, the bevel is only a 1 segment bevel, which is really a chamfer. And so it looks like that. If we want to round it out more, we can hold down Alt and roll up the number of segments here. So I'll go to maybe like 6 segments or so. And then we have a nice little rounded edge on this frame. So that seems good. We'll lock that in. Now it's looking a little bit more organic and nicer. Another thing we could do is we could change the outer shape of this frame, maybe add a little bit of interest instead of having square corners to it. So if we select that and we tab into edit mode on this thing, you'll remember really all this is this rectangle that we originally created. So I'll look at it from straight up above, and it's just really these 4 points are defining that entire frame with the modifiers that are listed over here on our right hand side. So I can select all 4 of those points and I can add a vertex bevel modifier to them. Now it's gonna go a little bit wonky here at first because ND gets a bit confused about things. So it actually jumped you see the whole width of the frame as soon as I start adding that bevel modifier grows like that. We can fix that by changing the number of segments that we're using here, and that'll roll it back into a nicer shape, and it keeps it inside of that original rectangle that we had in mind. So yeah, we'll go about there, I guess. We'll lock that in, and now we have rounded corners on our vent. So those were a few simple changes. Let's now change the shape of the fins. So instead of having them just go straight across, what if we wanted like a little notch or something like that in them? Well, we can go into edit mode on the fin. I'm gonna hit 1 on my numpad so we're looking at it from the end, and I'm gonna hit Alt Z so that outer frame object becomes semi-transparent. We can see through it. I'm gonna zoom in, and let's select this top line of the fin here, and let's just subdivide it a couple of times. That's enough. So that gives us a bunch of points here that we could play with. So we could grab, let's say, all of these here and just move them downward a bit, kind of like that. And we will hit Alt Z and move here so you can kind of see what that looks like. That's kind of interesting. I'd like the angle to be a little bit sharper, and I'd like probably it to start a little bit further in so we see more of that shape. So let's tab back in here again, and let's grab like these. Actually, you know what? Let's get rid of this point and this one. Yeah. And then we can move this one along the x-axis this way. We'll move it by like 0.5. Yeah, that's good. So that way, since I typed an exact number, I can do the same thing on the other side with negative 0.5. That way I'm sure they're still even. And let's move this one by negative 0.2. Yeah, that seems good. And this one likewise by positive 0.2, so it stays even. All right, that's pretty nice. I like that. So that's a way we can add some interest to the fins. What if you wanted to change the entire size, the overall size of this thing? Let's actually just make it a square. So we can grab, again in edit mode, we can just grab these 2 right-hand things, and it was 10 millimeters high by 5 wide. So if we move these in the X direction 5 over, that turns this whole thing into a square. Now, of course, the fins are too narrow at this point, right? So we can also then pick the fins and go into edit mode on those. And let's just grab like all 3 of these points. And again, we're just gonna move them over by 5 millimeters. And so they fill in that space like so. So now we have a wider square vent. I think I showed you in the intro a vent that had like a grid pattern of fins inside of it. How do we do that? Well, we can just grab this thing and duplicate it, right? So I select this, I hit Shift D, and I've got a second copy of this right now. I'm gonna right click so that I didn't move it. It's just sitting in the same spot on top of the one that was already there. And then I can rotate it around the Z axis by 90 degrees, right? So now it's over here. Now we're gonna have to move it into place, right? So we can move it on the Y and get it kind of up here. And then we can move it on the X and get it over here. And if we wanted to, we should probably go into hit 7 on the numpad so we can go into top-down mode and really dial that in so that it's nice and even and centered. I'll just do it visually. All right, There we go. And the interaction between these is a little strange because of the angle, the dip that we added in the middle, but that gives a kind of interesting look. So there's something we could do. Yeah, I think I'm happy with those modifications, and I hope that you were able to follow along and maybe play around and do some modifications of your own on top of what we've done here. I'm gonna take another quick break. I'm gonna go back to the original simple vent, and we'll use that again as a starting point and see what else we can make. Okay, so I've loaded us back to our basic vent. We'll do one more modification session here where we try to make this into something that's quite different from what it looks like right now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make a vent where the slats are running lengthwise through it instead of the short widthwise distance. So I think rather than turning the fins themselves, probably the easier way to do this would be to turn the vent. So let's go into the frame, and what I'll do is I'll grab these top 2 points and we're going to move them in the Y axis by -5. So we'll pull that halfway down, and then we'll push these 2 right hand points out to the right. So on the X axis by 5. So now we've just basically turned the frame 90 degrees, but without turning it, we've just moved its boundary points. So I think that'll be good. And obviously we're gonna have to move or rearrange those fins so that they fit better. But before we do that, let's make the frame a little bit narrower like we did last time. 1 millimeter is too much. I'm gonna go down to maybe 0.5 millimeter, maybe even less, but we'll go with 0.5 for now. And I also want to make this thing taller, the frame itself. So we'll go back to our profile extrude that we did way back at the beginning that determines the height of this thing. And I'm going to make it 2000, which is 2 millimeters tall. So now this from the side is much taller. It's lengthwise with the fins instead of widthwise. And then we can grab these guys and pull this out by 5 millimeters to fill in that space. And then of course now we have too many of these to fit across the width of this. Before we change that though, let's actually change the width of the fins themselves. So we'll go into their solidify modifier and roll this down. Again, I don't want to make this too narrow because it'll become hard to print. So I'm going to take it down to 300, which is 0.3 millimeters. And that's about as narrow as I want it to be. So now if we move this down here, there's still too many of them to fit here. And so we could either remove one of them or we could move them closer together. I think we'll do that. So let me look at from the top view so you can see this better. And if we bring back up our array modifier on these things and we go to the Y axis, we can hold down Control and bring down this offset. So that's not changing the number of fins, it's just moving them closer together. So maybe we'll do about like that. Lock that in, and then we can move this up like so. All right, so now we have these fins. They're very recessed down into the outer frame of our vent, and that's okay for now. We're gonna change the shape of those entirely in just a minute, but I wanna do something fun with the frame first. So I'm gonna select the frame, and I'm going to go into the ND menu, and we're gonna play with the deform options real quick here. So lattice is a bit complicated, and maybe we'll talk about that in a future episode, but simple deform is pretty fun to do. And actually before we do that, I'm going to shift around our view of this a little so that we can see it a little bit better as we look at these deform options. Okay, so I'm going to go back into here and we'll choose simple deform. So by default, the method there is twist, which just does what it says. It twists this. And that's not going to create anything useful for us here. So we can toggle through other methods. This is the bend method. That's pretty interesting. Just quickly, I'll show you a few of the others. This one's taper, which kind of lifts it up and also spreads it out. And then this one is stretch, which is pretty crazy. So I liked that bend method, and I clicked by accident, which locks it in. I'm going to undo that. And we're gonna bring that up again, and I'm gonna not click this time. So we'll go bend, but I'd wanna do the bend along the Y axis instead, yeah? That seems cool. So now we can pull this down, pull it quite far down, I guess, like this. So we've got this angled frame. So from the side, it looks like that. From the top, it's still just a rectangle. Now let's do something interesting with these fins, yeah? So I'm gonna select them, I'm gonna tab into edit mode, and I'm gonna look at this from the side, and I'm gonna hit Alt-Z so we can see through that outer frame. So here's our very simple fin right now. It's just got the 4 points that define its rectangular shape. Let's give ourselves a few more points to work with. So I'm gonna select this top line, and I'm going to subdivide it a few times. If I can actually use my mouse correctly. There we go. Yeah, let's go one more time. So now we have a ton of points to play with. So let's grab this one first and pull it kind of up this way to follow that edge. This one over here obviously needs to be down here so that it's inside of the vent. And then all of these ones in between we could potentially use as ways to make an interesting shape. So maybe we want this to kind of follow this slope downward at first, but then have a kind of big dip like so, and then maybe come straight across, maybe bounce back up a little bit. Something like this. We'll drop it again a little bit lower yet, and then we'll maybe bring it over, and then we'll bring it up above the edge, the outer edge of the vent, and then maybe down like so, down a little more. Yeah, that seems good. Oops. All right, and then maybe an angle something like this. We'll pull these out like this. We probably didn't need this many points at the bottom end here, so I'm just going to dissolve a couple of them. Cool. So now we have a really weird shaped fin in our vent, and I'll tab out of edit mode here and hit Alt-Z so it's solid again, and then we'll go look at it here, right? So now we've created something like this. Now again, all of this is very blocky looking, so you could go in and put some bevels. Actually, let's do that, right? So let's put a bevel on the frame. I don't know if I want it as a chamfer like this or an actual bevel. I kind of like it like this. We could hit Alt and play with the segments and decide if we like this better or this better. Yeah, I like it with the sharp edge, so we'll leave it like so. Lock that in. And then we could round these out, but what'll happen, I'll show you, is that if we add a bevel here, it will not only bevel the sides of these things, but also all of those angles that we so carefully created. And I like those to be sharp, like the up and down angles as you go through the fins there. So I'm not sure that I would do this on this one. I think I would leave these sharp. So I'm gonna hit escape here and cancel out of that. So yeah, here's a vent that is pretty different from where we started. And you can be really creative if you want to, you know, add a bunch of more points to the fins themselves or even to the frame. You can change the shape of things. You could make this not a rectangular shape, but some other unusual shape if you've got a certain area that you need to fill in on a kit that's not rectangular. So all of those things are options to you just by going into edit mode and then changing the points that define these different basic shapes that we've used to create this thing. All right, so that concludes our very first project in the series. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or you got stuck on something, definitely post those in the comments down below. I'll either answer them down there if that's possible, or if it's something too complicated to talk about just in a comment response, I will take those things into consideration, and in future videos, I'll make sure to cover any questions or things that you guys have that you're not quite sure about. Also, if you make your own variation of one of these vents and you want to share that with me, either print it out yourself and take a picture or just screenshot your design in Blender, you can anywhere on social media go ahead and just post that picture and use the hashtag BlenderGunpla. I'll be watching for those things, and I'm excited to see what you create as well. One last thing, and I'm not gonna do this on every single one of these videos, but since this is the first project we've done in the series, if you enjoyed the video, if it helped you out, definitely leave a like down there for me, and subscribe if you haven't too, but mostly the likes, since this is a new series, and since I don't have a lot of subscribers on the channel, I want to try to do the best we can to convince YouTube to go ahead and show this to more people, because I think it's content that can be helpful for a lot of people. So with that, thank you for watching. I hope you had fun. I enjoyed making all of these vents, and we'll make something else next time. I'll see you then.